Story begins with 5 young people going on a camping trip. As they drove into a cornfield, flocks of crows suddenly appeared around them. Before they can react, the crows slam into the front windshield of their SUV, causing it to lose control and crash into the cornfield. Fortunately, they were all wearing seatbelts, which saved their lives. But then Chris notices that Johnny, who is sitting in the passenger seat, has disappeared. Scott tries to call the police, but there's no signal out here in the wilderness. Then he spots a house in the distance, about 100 meters away, and guesses that Johnny might have gone there to seek help. So, Scott asks Brian to go with him to the house to look for their friend. Meanwhile, Chris and Brian's girlfriend, Natalie, stay behind to guard the scene. Scott and Brian soon enter the cornfield, but as they walk, it feels like they've entered a vast maze. Despite the short distance to the house, they end up wandering for hours. Then Brian notices an old car, with a unique design clearly from the previous century. The front windshield of the car also has the same marks from crows colliding with it. It looks like the car's owner experienced something similar to what they're going through. Meanwhile, Scott makes a disturbing discovery. He finds countless dead crows scattered on the ground, and not far away, there's a creepy scarecrow hanging nearby. Scott gets an idea and asks Brian to help him climb to get a better view. As the saying goes, you see farther from up high. Sure enough, he spots the house, and they quickly make their way through the cornfield to it. Inside, the room is dark and decaying, filled with the stench of rotting bodies. It's clear that no one has lived here in a long time. Then, they hear strange sounds coming from upstairs. Following the noises, they reach the second floor, open the door, and find a man frantically pedaling a sewing machine. Gathering their courage, they approach, only to realize that the man is their friend, Johnny. But something's off. Johnny looks strange, covered in wounds, and when they ask him what happened, he doesn't respond. He just keeps pedaling the sewing machine, as if he's sewing a cloth bag. Clearly, Johnny is no longer a normal person. On the other side, Chris, who stayed behind, took out a knife and tried to start the car using the most primitive method. Meanwhile, Natalie, with nothing else to do, wandered along the road, hoping to find a local. However, not far from there, she stumbled upon a stone tablet in a ditch. The text on it appeared to be damaged, and its meaning was unclear. As Natalie pondered over it, she suddenly heard movement from the cornfield. When she looked closely, she saw a child staring at her. As soon as the child realized he was seen, he disappeared. Natalie rushed over to check, only to find a scarecrow. Cautiously, she lifted the head covering, only to reveal sharp, jagged teeth inside. Natalie's scream quickly drew Chris over to her. However, Chris dismissed her claims, thinking she was overreacting. After all, it looked like just a scarecrow. Seeing that Chris wouldn't believe her, Natalie didn't waste more time arguing. She turned back to the car to grab her clothes, intending to find her boyfriend Brian on her own. Reluctantly, Chris followed her to protect her, despite his unwillingness. Worried about her boyfriend's safety, Natalie quickened her pace, quickly putting distance between herself and Chris. It was then that Natalie realized someone seemed to be following her. The shifting figure was clearly not Chris. Scared, Natalie froze, unsure of what to do. Then, suddenly, a scream pierced the air, and Brian rushed out of the cabin, frantically searching for his girlfriend. But after a desperate search, he could only hear her voice.
He couldn't see her.
Fortunately, Chris spotted Natalie's figure first. Before he could reach her, however, the creature dragged Natalie away, disappearing without a trace. Both Chris and Brian quickly pursued the creature, but as nightfall came, they found Natalie hanging upside down on a wooden post in an open field. She was covered in blood and was already lifeless. Brian wanted to take her down, but the more he pulled, the tighter the ropes became. Seeing this, Brian rushed to the back to remove the steel nails holding the rope. Meanwhile, Chris stood frozen, staring at Natalie's lifeless body, their eyes locked. Soon, Chris noticed that Natalie's eyes were turning white. Terrified, he ran for his life. After struggling to get his girlfriend down, Brian was carrying her body back to the cabin when the creature reappeared in the cornfield, dragging Natalie's body away again in the blink of an eye. Brian used all his strength to chase after the creature, and finally, he caught it. But to his shock, it was just a scarecrow. As he attacked the scarecrow, another one suddenly appeared behind him, This one slashed Brian's shoulder with its razor-sharp claws. Severely injured, Brian could only helplessly watch as his girlfriend's body was dragged away once again. In the end, he fought through the pain and managed to crawl out of the cornfield. Scott saw Brian returning and quickly went to meet him, but then, suddenly, they realized that the Scarecrows likely couldn't leave the cornfield. The safest place for all three of them was the cabin. After helping Brian tend to his wounds, Scott went upstairs to check on Johnny. However, when he entered the sewing room, he found it empty. Johnny was gone. Panicked, Scott hurriedly told Brian about the situation. As the bravest of the three, Brian was determined to get his friends out alive. With this belief in mind, he called Scott to join him as they stepped outside, hoping to find a way to escape. In the backyard of the cabin, they discovered several cars, one of which appeared to be in good condition and still usable. However, after searching the entire car, they found no keys. As they continued their search, Scott discovered a scarecrow on top of a cabinet. He moved closer to investigate. But the next moment, the scarecrow suddenly moved, freezing Scott in shock. At that moment, Scott saw a crow perched on a beam, and it triggered a strange vision. In the vision, Farmer Comstock was teaching his eldest son, Alex, how to dissect an animal's carcass. Alex's skillful technique earned praise from Comstock. Just then, Comstock seemed to notice Scott's presence. As Comstock quickly walked toward him, Scott realized that in the direction Comstock was heading, his younger son, Corey, was hiding in the corner, trembling with fear. Though both Alex and Corey were Comstock's sons, they were polar opposites in character. Alex was bold, calculating, and favored by his father, while Corey was weak, indecisive, and often subjected to his father's abuse. Just as Scott was about to delve deeper into the vision, Brian's furious shout brought him back to reality. Meanwhile, Chris was rummaging through the room, looking for something to defend himself with. When he saw a key fall to the ground, he immediately picked it up. But just as he picked up the key, a dark shadow flashed past him. Terrified, he grabbed a small knife and locked himself in the room upstairs. Through the window, he tried to see if his friends were back, but to his horror, he saw that the shadow had entered through the front door. At the same time, the lights in the room eerily flickered on. With the sound of footsteps growing nearer from the stairs, Chris's heart raced with fear. The next moment, the door to the room opened on its own. What followed was the film's most terrifying scene. Chris's horror deepened as he saw the deceased Natalie standing and walking. But she didn't seem to want to hurt him. Instead, she walked straight to the sewing machine and began sewing a scarecrow's head covering. Then, the door automatically closed, and Brian and Scott, who had just returned, heard the noise. Chris quickly told them that Natalie was in the room. Hearing this, Brian went wild, pounding on the wooden door, but no matter how hard he tried, it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, Brian ran to the storage room to grab an axe, leaving Scott to instruct Chris to escape through the window. Just as Chris was about to climb out, Natalie's gaze shifted toward him. Fortunately, Chris only sustained a finger injury. Nothing serious. By the time Brian arrived with the axe and opened the door, Natalie's figure had disappeared. The series of strange events made Chris just want to leave as soon as possible. He grabbed the car keys, ready to leave with everyone. But Brian had other plans. He insisted on staying behind to continue searching for his girlfriend. After saying this, he took the keys from Chris. Seeing the growing tension between Chris and Brian, Scott tried to mediate. But when his efforts failed, he decided to step outside for a moment to clear his head. However, at that moment, Scott experienced another vision. He saw Corey standing in the cornfield, waving at him. Following him, Scott witnessed Corey take the life of his own brother Alex with his own hands. Scott was terrified. He tried to run, but in his panic, he became entangled in a rope and was hoisted upside down, hanging from a wooden post. Just then, the Scarecrow appeared again, attacking Scott. The Scarecrow tore at him with its claws. Just when he thought he was doomed, Brian arrived in time. Armed with a massive axe, he struck the Scarecrow's head, shattering it to pieces, and saved Scott. He then helped Scott back to the cabin. After bandaging Scott's wounds, Brian led him into the storage room to search for weapons. Luckily, they found a hunting rifle. But just as they were celebrating their luck, the cowardly Chris had started the car by using the double ignition method. He quickly drove it into the cornfield, hoping to escape the nightmare. Hearing the engine, Brian rushed out with the shotgun, chasing after Chris. But in his haste, Chris crashed the car into a wooden post. It was now impossible to restart the vehicle. As he prepared to leave the car, a scarecrow suddenly appeared before him. With a fierce blow, it smashed the windshield. The scarecrow lunged into the car, attempting to devour Chris. However, its body became stuck, giving Chris a chance to pull off its head covering. To his horror, it was Johnny, their deceased friend. Brian soon caught up, urging Chris to leave immediately while he stayed behind to cover him. But just as Chris left, another scarecrow appeared. Brian recognized it immediately. It was his girlfriend. Brian lowered his rifle, letting the scarecrow approach. Meanwhile, staying at the cabin, Scott experienced another hallucination. He saw Corey emerge from the cornfield, walk straight up to the second floor, and sew a headpiece. Afterward, he returned along the same path, turned Alex's body into a scarecrow, and tied it to a post. It wasn't until Chris returned in a panic that Scott snapped back to reality. Listening to the screams coming from the cornfield, they realized that Brian had met his end. Now, only the two of them were left alive. However, the deaths of their friends had provided Scott with some crucial information. From what they'd seen, it was clear that Alex's soul couldn't leave the cornfield. This much was undeniable. Once someone entered the cornfield, it triggered the scarecrow's territorial instinct, and after killing them, it took control of their soul to hunt others. As for why Scott and Brian weren't attacked when they first entered the cornfield, Scott theorized that Alex could only control one soul at a time, and he needed to finish sewing the headpiece before returning to the cornfield to carry out the killings. At the time when Scott and Brian crossed the cornfield, Johnny, who had already died, was upstairs sewing the scarecrow headpiece, which is why they had passed through safely. Having figured this out, they finally saw a way to escape. Now, they just had to wait for someone to come and sew another scarecrow headpiece. That would be their chance to get out. As soon as Scott finished speaking, Brian, who was already dead, walked straight up to the second floor. Scott and Chris immediately knew that their opportunity had arrived, and they quickly grabbed some supplies and headed toward the cornfield. However, before they could make it out, the lights on the second floor suddenly went out, and the scarecrow headpiece had already been completed. This meant the hunt was about to begin. At a critical moment, Scott proposed splitting up to take action. He would be responsible for filling the cornfield with gasoline, and once set on fire, the scarecrow would have nowhere to hide, and the crisis would naturally be resolved. Chris, meanwhile, would stay alert with a shotgun, ready to fire at any target that appeared. The plan seemed perfect, but reality was harsh. Before Chris could pull the trigger, the scarecrow violently slammed into him. Meanwhile, Scott was preparing to set the cornfield on fire, but his lighter refused to work at the crucial moment. In the next second, the scarecrow appeared behind him and knocked him out with a single punch. When Scott regained consciousness, his legs were tied, and he was brought to a wooden post. There, he saw the barely alive Chris hanging upside down, enduring brutal torture from the scarecrows. Suddenly, Scott remembered the scene when Corey had killed Alex. He groped around, and sure enough, he found a pitchfork nearby. Grabbing the pitchfork, Scott stabbed the scarecrow repeatedly until it finally stopped moving. Just as Scott was about to leave, the scarecrow suddenly revived and stood back up. Thankfully, Chris bought Scott enough time to escape with his life. Just as Scott was about to escape the cornfield, he collapsed at the edge due to his severe injuries. At this time, he saw a vehicle passing by and was checking the scene. Scott wanted to shout for help, but his body was too weak. Soon, the scarecrow followed him and lay in wait, ready to strike again. Sure enough, it didn't take long before the driver spotted Scott in the beam of their flashlight. At this point, the film ended. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.